My name is Martha, and I'm 32 years old. Standing in my mother's living room last Thanksgiving, surrounded by the warm chatter of family, I never imagined I'd be the one to shatter the illusion we'd all been living under for years. When those words left my mother's lips, "You're just jealous of your sister," something inside me finally snapped. I looked around at all those familiar faces, at my sister Brenda's smug smile, and I knew it was time to tell them what really happened in that room upstairs just 20 minutes earlier. Before I share what really happened, let me know where you're watching from and hit that like button. Trust me, you'll want to hear every word of the story because what I'm about to reveal changed everything. Let me paint you a picture of my family. My mother Dolores, 58 years old, has spent the last 30 years raising my sister Brenda and me after our father passed away when we were young. She worked double shifts at the hospital to keep us fed, clothed, and in school. Brenda, my younger sister at 28, has always been the golden child. Straight A student, homecoming queen, graduated summa cum laude from college, landed a prestigious job at a marketing firm in Manhattan right out of school. Meanwhile, there's me, Martha, the older sister who tried just as hard but somehow never quite measured up. I worked my way through community college while helping mom with bills. I've had a series of decent jobs, nothing glamorous, but I've always been responsible, reliable, the one who shows up when family needs help. Yet somehow, in every family gathering, every phone call, every conversation, I felt like I was living in Brenda's shadow. You know how some people just have this natural charm? That's Brenda. She walks into a room and everyone gravitates toward her. She has this way of making people feel special, like they're the most important person in the world when she's talking to them. But I started noticing things over the years. Little things, how conversations would somehow always circle back to her achievements, how she'd offer to help with problems she somehow already knew about, how she'd show up at just the right moment to be the hero of every situation. I tried talking to mom about it once, about 3 years ago. I mentioned how Brenda seemed to know about my personal struggles before I'd told anyone. Mom just smiled and said Brenda was intuitive, that she cared deeply about family. When I pressed further, suggesting maybe Brenda wasn't as perfect as she seemed, Mom's expression hardened. She told me I was being negative, that I should be grateful to have such a caring sister. That conversation left me feeling more isolated than ever. The thing about being the overlooked child is that you start to question your own perceptions. Maybe I was imagining things. Maybe I was just bitter about not being the favorite. Maybe Brenda really was just naturally gifted at everything while I was naturally average. But deep down, something always felt off about the timing of her kindnesses, and the way certain opportunities in my life seemed to evaporate just before Brenda would swoop in with comfort and advice. This particular Thanksgiving started like all the others. Brenda had just returned from a month-long business trip to Europe, closing some major deal that had everyone talking about a possible promotion. She looked radiant, tanned from weekend trips to Barcelona and Rome, carrying expensive gifts for everyone. Designer scarves for mom and our aunts, Swiss chocolate for the cousins, artisanal olive oil that she'd personally selected from a family farm in Tuscany. I, on the other hand, had just been laid off 2 weeks earlier. The small nonprofit where I'd worked for 4 years had lost their major funding, and they'd had to let go of half their staff. I was still processing the shock of it, still trying to figure out how I was going to make rent next month. I'd brought store-bought dinner rolls and a bottle of wine that cost $12. The contrast couldn't have been starker. As we gathered around Mom's dining table, the conversation naturally centered on Brenda's adventures. She regaled everyone with stories about business dinners in Milan, about the sophisticated Europeans she'd impressed with her presentation skills, about how her supervisor had hinted at a corner office in her future. Her eyes sparkled as she described the art galleries she'd visited, the charming bed and breakfast where she'd stayed in the French countryside. Mom hung on every word, asking follow-up questions, exclaiming over photos on Brenda's phone, "Look at that pasta dish, isn't that something? And Brenda, you look so professional in that conference room. I'm so proud of you, honey." The pride in Mom's voice was unmistakable, the kind of warmth I'd spent my whole life hoping to hear directed at me. When the conversation finally shifted to me, it was with the careful tone people use when discussing someone's misfortune. "How are you holding up, Martha?" Brenda asked, her voice dripping with what sounded like genuine concern. "Mom told me about the layoffs. That must be so difficult for you." I explained that it had been unexpected, that I was actively job hunting, that I had some savings to tide me over. I tried to keep my voice upbeat, professional. But Brenda's response cut deep. Well, at least you have some time to figure out what you really want to do with your life. Maybe this is a blessing in disguise. Sometimes when we're not growing in our careers, the universe has a way of pushing us towards something better suited to our abilities. The word stung, especially the phrase better suited to our abilities. It was the kind of comment that sounded supportive on the surface but carried an unmistakable implication underneath. Mom nodded approvingly, as if Brenda had offered profound wisdom. Her cousins murmured agreement about silver linings and new opportunities. As dinner wound down, Brenda touched my arm gently. Hey, why don't we go upstairs and catch up properly? I feel like we never get real sister time at these family things. Her smile was warm, inviting. Everyone else smiled too, appreciating the sweet gesture from the successful sister to the struggling one. Our childhood bedroom had been preserved almost exactly as we'd left it. Twin beds with matching floral comforters, a shared desk where we'd done homework, walls still decorated with participation ribbons from school events and family photos from better times. The room smelled faintly of the lavender sachets Mom tucked into all the drawers, a scent that immediately transported me back to being 10 years old, whispering secrets under blankets after lights out. Brenda closed the door behind us with a soft click, and immediately, something in her demeanor shifted. The warm, concerned expression melted away, replaced by something colder, more calculated. She sat on her old bed and looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before, direct, almost predatory. So how does it feel? She asked, her voice completely different from the sympathetic tone she'd used downstairs. How does what feel? I was confused by the sudden change in her energy. Being unemployed again. Failing again. She smiled, but it wasn't kind. I have to admit, this one was almost too easy. My stomach dropped. What are you talking about? Brenda leaned back against her pillows, completely relaxed now, like she was finally getting to have a conversation she'd been looking forward to. Come on, Martha. Did you really think it was a coincidence that your funding got pulled right after I had lunch with Rebecca Morrison? Rebecca Morrison. The name hit me like a physical blow. She was on the board of the foundation that had been our nonprofit's primary donor. I'd met her once at a fundraising event, but I had no idea Brenda knew her. Rebecca's daughter goes to the same yoga studio as me in Manhattan. We got to talking one day, and it turns out Rebecca sits on several nonprofit boards. When she mentioned your organization, I just had to share some concerns I had about their financial management. Nothing specific, you understand, just general observations about efficiency and accountability. I stared at her, trying to process what I was hearing. You got me fired. I didn't get you fired. The funding dried up. These things happen in the nonprofit world all the time. Organizations that can't prove their worth don't survive. She examined her manicured nails casually. I just helped accelerate what was probably inevitable anyway. The room felt like it was tilting. Why would you do that? Because you were getting too comfortable there. 4 years in the same position, making $35,000 a year. Martha, you're 32 years old. It was embarrassing. For the whole family, her words were delivered with such casual cruelty that I couldn't immediately respond. This wasn't the sister I'd grown up with, the one who'd helped me with math homework and shared midnight snacks when we couldn't sleep. This was someone else entirely. But this isn't the first time, is it? She continued, as if we were discussing the weather. Remember when you were dating Kevin in college, such a sweet guy, really seemed to care about you. It was a shame he heard those rumors about you cheating on him with your study group partner. That wasn't true. I never cheated on Kevin. Of course it wasn't true. But Kevin didn't know that when his roommate told him he'd seen you getting cozy with Marcus at the library. Amazing how these stories spread, isn't it? My mind raced back 7 years to the painful breakup that had left me devastated for months. Kevin had accused me of things I'd never done, said he'd heard from multiple sources that I'd been unfaithful. I'd begged him to tell me who had said these things, but he'd refused, said it didn't matter because the evidence was clear. You destroyed my relationship. I protected him from making a mistake. Kevin deserved better than someone who was just using him for emotional support while she figured out her life. You weren't ready for a serious relationship then. You're probably not ready now. The casual way she dismissed years of my life, relationships that had meant everything to me, was breathtaking in its cruelty. But she wasn't done. And that scholarship you applied for senior year, the one for first-generation college students pursuing social work, it really was competitive. 20 applicants for one award. But when I mentioned to the selection committee that your family actually owned property and had more resources than you'd indicated on your application, Well, they had to reconsider whether you truly represented their target demographic. I remembered that scholarship, $5,000 that would have paid for my entire final semester, allowing me to focus on my studies instead of working 30 hours a week at the campus bookstore. When the rejection letter came, I'd assumed I simply wasn't qualified enough, that other candidates had better grades or more compelling essays. We never owned property. We rented that house, but we owned the little cabin upstate that Dad left us. Technically, that made us property owners. I just made sure they had all the relevant information to make their decision. The cabin, a tiny, winterized hunting cottage that we'd visited maybe 5 times in our entire childhood. It was worth perhaps $20,000 and had been sitting empty for years because none of us could afford the maintenance costs. You've been sabotaging my life for years. I've been protecting this family's reputation. Every time you started to succeed at something, you'd inevitably mess it up anyway. I just saved everyone the disappointment of watching you fail publicly. She stood up and smoothed her designer dress. Look, Martha, we both know how this works. I'm the successful one. You're the one who struggles. I'm the daughter Mom brags about. You're the one she worries about. That's our dynamic, and it works for everyone. It doesn't work for me, because you keep fighting it. Accept who you are. Be grateful that you have a sister who's willing to take care of things, who can represent this family well in professional circles. Stop trying to compete with me and start appreciating what I do for everyone. She moved toward the door, her hand on the handle. And Martha, if you even think about repeating this conversation to anyone downstairs, remember that I have years of evidence about your instability, your jealousy, your tendency to blame others for your own shortcomings. No one will believe you. They'll just see a bitter, unemployed woman lashing out at her successful sister. The door opened, and instantly her expression transformed back into the caring, concerned sister. Take all the time you need up here, okay? I know this is a hard time for you, and family should always be here to support each other. She left me alone in that room, surrounded by the remnants of our childhood, with the devastating realization that everything I'd believed about my life had been a lie. I sat on my old bed for what felt like hours, but was probably only 15 minutes. The magnitude of what Brenda had revealed was almost too much to process. Every failure, every disappointment, every moment when I'd wondered why things seemed to go wrong just when they were going right, suddenly had an explanation. And it wasn't that I was unlucky or incapable or cursed with bad timing. It was that my own sister had been systematically destroying my opportunities for years. The memories came flooding back with new clarity. The scholarship rejection that had forced me to take out additional student loans. The job at the art gallery that I'd interviewed for twice, only to be told they'd decided to go with an internal candidate after the gallery owner received a call expressing concerns about my reliability. The apartment I'd almost rented in a better neighborhood, until the landlord suddenly changed his mind about my application after speaking with someone who claimed to know my character. How many times had Brenda appeared in the aftermath of these disappointments with comfort, advice, and financial help? She'd been there to loan me money for tuition when the scholarship fell through. She'd helped me find my current apartment when the other rental didn't work out. She'd even recommended me for the nonprofit job, introducing me to the hiring manager through one of her professional contacts. I'd always been grateful for her support, touched by how she showed up during my lowest moments. Now I understood that she'd engineered those low moments in the first place. She was the arsonist and the firefighter, creating crises so she could swoop in as the hero. When I finally made my way back downstairs, the family gathering was in full swing. Brenda was in the kitchen with Mom and our Aunt Paula, drying dishes and sharing more stories from her European adventure. She looked up when I entered, her expression perfectly calibrated to show just the right amount of concern. "Feeling better?" she asked, her voice carrying just enough volume for everyone to hear. "I was worried about you up there." Mom turned to me with sympathetic eyes. "Honey, I know the job situation is stressful, but you'll find something soon. You always do. And in the meantime, you know you have family support." Our cousin Janet nodded from the living room. "The job market is so tough right now. But you're smart and hardworking. Something good will come along." The conversation continued around me as if scripted. Everyone offering encouragement, sharing stories of their own career challenges, expressing confidence in my resilience. And through it all, Brenda played her part perfectly. the successful sister offering wisdom, the family star who remained humble and supportive despite her own achievements. But now I could see the performance for what it was, the subtle ways she steered conversations to highlight my struggles while minimizing them just enough to seem generous rather than cruel, the carefully timed anecdotes about her own career that served as implicit contrasts to my situation, the offers of help that came with just enough conditions attached to feel more like reminders of my dependence than genuine assistance. You know, Brenda said as she folded the dish towel, I was thinking about Martha's situation earlier, and I might have some connections who could help. I know several people in the nonprofit sector in Manhattan. Maybe we could set up some informational interviews. The offer sounded generous, caring even, but after what I'd learned upstairs, I understood it differently. Another opportunity for her to control my narrative, to position herself as my benefactor while ensuring that any opportunities came through her influence and could be revoked at her discretion. That's so thoughtful of you, Mom said, beaming at Brenda. See, Martha, this is what family is for. Supporting each other. I watched Brenda's face as Mom spoke, saw the tiny smile of satisfaction that flickered across her features before she arranged her expression back into appropriate humility. She was enjoying this. Not just the praise from Mom, but my discomfort, my realization that I was trapped in a web she'd been weaving for years. The breaking point came an hour later. We were all gathered in the living room, the post-dinner lethargy setting in as everyone settled into comfortable chairs with coffee and leftover pie. The conversation had moved on to holiday plans, vacation stories, and gentle family gossip. I was sitting quietly, still processing everything I'd learned, when Uncle Herbert brought up his daughter's recent wedding. Sarah looked beautiful, he was saying, and her new husband seems like a good man, stable job, treats her well. It's wonderful to see her settled and happy. Mom nodded approvingly. There's something to be said for stability in a partner. Someone reliable who shows up consistently. Brenda set down her coffee cup with a thoughtful expression. I think Martha knows how important that is. She's always been so focused on building a stable foundation for herself before committing to serious relationships. It's actually quite mature, even if it means being single longer than some people might expect. The comment was masterfully crafted. On the surface, it sounded like praise for my thoughtfulness and maturity, but embedded within it were several barbs, the implication that I was still building a foundation while others my age had already built theirs, the suggestion that my single status was a choice rather than a series of relationships that had been sabotaged. The phrase, longer than some people might expect, carried the subtle implication that at 32, I was approaching an age where being unmarried was becoming notable. Aunt Paula picked up the thread. Oh, Martha's always been particular about who she dates. Nothing wrong with having standards. Absolutely, Brenda agreed. Though sometimes I worry that she might be a little too critical of potential partners. Remember Kevin from college? He was such a sweet boy, really seemed devoted to her. But Martha always found reasons why it wouldn't work long term. I felt my jaw clench. She was rewriting history in real time, making my devastation over Kevin's breakup into my choice to end things, making herself sound concerned and protective while implanting the idea that I was difficult to please, prone to pushing away good men for trivial reasons. Mom joined in with her own perspective. Martha's always been independent. Sometimes I think she's almost too independent, you know. She has trouble accepting help, even from family. It's hard to watch sometimes, Brenda added softly. I've tried to offer support over the years, but she often seems to prefer struggling on her own rather than letting people who care about her make things easier. The revisionist narrative was breathtaking. My years of accepting her help, my gratitude for her support, my constant appreciation for her generosity, all of it was being reframed as stubbornness and pride. She was setting up the story so that any future revelation about her interference would sound like the complaints of someone who bit the hand that fed her. Uncle Herbert, well-meaning but oblivious to the undercurrents, offered his own observation. Maybe what Martha needs is someone who can match her independence, someone successful in their own right, who doesn't need to be taken care of. That would be ideal, Brenda agreed. Though I sometimes wonder if Martha might feel intimidated by really successful men. It can be challenging to be with someone whose career is thriving when your own professional life has had its ups and downs. That was when Mom delivered the words that finally pushed me past my breaking point. Oh, Brenda, that's not fair. Martha's not intimidated by success. She's just jealous of your sister. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Around the room, family members shifted uncomfortably, not sure whether Mom had meant to voice that thought out loud. But the damage was done. In one sentence, she'd reduced all my struggles, all my pain, all my legitimate concerns about family dynamics to simple jealousy. Brenda's expression was perfect. A slight widening of the eyes, a small intake of breath, a look that suggested she was as surprised and uncomfortable as everyone else. But I caught the flash of triumph that preceded the surprise, the momentary satisfaction, before she arranged her features into appropriate shock. "Mom," she said gently, "I don't think that's really fair to Martha." But it was too late. The accusation was out there, and it crystallized everything I'd been feeling for years. This was how they saw me, not as someone who'd been systematically undermined, but as someone whose complaints were rooted in envy. Not as a victim of manipulation, but as a bitter sister who couldn't celebrate her sibling's success. I stood up slowly, feeling every eye in the room turn to me. This was it, the moment when I could either swallow this final insult and continue living in Brenda's shadow, or tell the truth and face whatever consequences came with it. "You want to know about jealousy," I said, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my system. "Let me tell you what really happened in that room upstairs." The room went completely silent. I could hear the grandfather clock in the hallway ticking, the distant hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, the sound of my own heartbeat in my ears. Every face was turned toward me, expressions ranging from curious to concern to, in Brenda's case, carefully controlled alarm. 20 minutes ago, I began, Brenda told me exactly how she's been sabotaging my life for years. Starting with Kevin in college. "Martha," Brenda said softly, her voice carrying just the right note of worry, "I think you might be upset and maybe misremembering our conversation." But I was done with her performances. She told me how she spread rumors about me cheating on Kevin, how she made sure the scholarship committee knew about Dad's cabin so I'd lose my financial aid, how she talked to Rebecca Morrison about my organization's financial management to get our funding pulled. The silence deepened. Mom's face had gone pale. Uncle Herbert was frowning, trying to process what he was hearing. Aunt Paula had set down her coffee cup and was staring at Brenda with a confused expression. "Those are very serious accusations," Mom said carefully. "Brenda, what is Martha talking about?" Brenda's response was textbook manipulation. Her eyes filled with tears. Her voice became smaller, more vulnerable. "I don't know, Mom. We were just talking about her job situation, and I was trying to be supportive. I offered to make some calls, see if any of my contacts could help her find something new. But she seemed really angry, and now she's saying these horrible things." It was masterful. She'd positioned herself as the victim, the caring sister whose kindness was being met with wild accusations from an unstable sibling. She'd implied that I was having some kind of breakdown, that grief over my job loss was making me paranoid and irrational. But I'd learned something important from years of watching Brenda work. The key to a good manipulation is making it impossible to disprove, but the key to exposing a manipulation is evidence. I pulled out my phone. "You want proof? Let me read you the text Brenda sent me 6 months ago." Brenda's carefully controlled expression flickered. For just a moment, I saw panic flash across her features before she regained control. I opened my messages and found the thread I was looking for. 6 months ago, after I'd told the family about a promising interview at a different nonprofit, Brenda had sent me what I'd thought was a supportive message. At the time, I'd been touched by her encouragement and advice. Now I understood it differently. "Here's what she wrote," I said, reading directly from my phone. "Martha, I'm so excited about your interview tomorrow. I did a little research on the organization, and I have some concerns I wanted to share. Their board has several members who overlap with other nonprofits that have had funding issues. You might want to be prepared for questions about financial management and organizational efficiency. Also, I noticed their current programs seem to lack measurable outcomes, which donors are really focused on these days. Don't let them put you in a position where you'd be responsible for metrics you can't control. You're so much better suited to organizations with established systems and proven track records. I just want to make sure you don't end up in another unstable situation where funding might be an issue." I looked up from my phone. At the time, I thought she was being helpful, warning me about potential problems so I could prepare better answers. But she wasn't preparing me for the interview. She was preparing me to talk myself out of the job. The room was completely still. Mom was staring at Brenda with an expression I'd never seen before. A mixture of confusion, hurt, and the beginning of understanding. "And here's the message she sent the day after I didn't get that position," I continued. "Martha, I'm so sorry the interview didn't work out. I have to admit, after doing more research, I think you dodged a bullet. The organization has some real red flags in terms of stability. But don't worry, something better suited to your skills will come along. In the meantime, you know you can count on family support." I put my phone down and looked directly at Brenda. "You didn't research the organization to help me prepare. You researched it to find ammunition you could plant in my head to make me sabotage my own interview. Then you followed up with comfort and reassurance, positioning yourself as the supportive sister while making sure I'd associate my failure with your help." Brenda opened her mouth to respond, but I wasn't finished. "And here's the really sick part. I have 17 messages like this over the past 5 years. Every time I had an opportunity, every time something good was happening in my life, Brenda would send these helpful messages that were actually designed to undermine my confidence and plant doubts in my head." I started scrolling through my phone, finding message after message. Here's one from when I was dating Alex last year. She sent me articles about how rebound relationships rarely work long-term, how men in their 30s who haven't been married yet often have commitment issues, how important it is not to settle for someone just because you're lonely. "That sounds like caring advice," Uncle Herbert said, though his voice was uncertain. "It would be if it was coming from someone who actually cared about my happiness, but Alex wasn't a rebound. I'd been single for 8 months before I met him, and he told me on our third date that he'd been focused on building his business for the past few years but was ready to settle down now." Brenda's messages weren't based on reality. They were designed to make me question a good relationship. I found another message. Here's what she sent when I told the family I was thinking about applying for a master's program in social work. She wrote that graduate school was a huge financial commitment, that the job market for social workers was oversaturated, that I might be better off gaining more practical experience first. She offered to introduce me to some people in the field who could tell me about the realities of the profession. Mom's voice was barely above a whisper. "Did you apply to the program?" "No." After talking to Brenda's contacts, who all emphasized how difficult the field was, how low the pay was, how burned out most social workers became, I decided to wait. That was 3 years ago. I'm still waiting. The pieces were falling into place, and I could see understanding dawning on the faces around me. The pattern was becoming clear. Not just the sabotage, but the systematic way Brenda had positioned herself as my advisor and supporter while ensuring that I never actually succeeded at anything. "But here's the message that really tells the story," I said, finding the text I'd been looking for. This one was sent right after I lost my job, before the family dinner tonight, before she knew I was going to confront her. I read the message aloud. "Martha, I know losing your job feels devastating right now, but I have to be honest, I think this might be exactly what you needed. You'd gotten too comfortable there, and you weren't growing professionally. Sometimes the universe pushes us out of situations that aren't serving our highest good. I have some ideas about next steps that might be perfect for you. Let's talk at dinner tonight." I looked up from my phone. She wasn't surprised by my job loss because she wasn't finding out about it for the first time. She already knew it was going to happen because she'd made it happen. The silence that followed was deafening. I watched as 20 years of family dynamics shifted in real time. Mom's face had gone from confusion to horror to something approaching rage. Uncle Herbert was shaking his head slowly as if trying to clear water from his ears. Aunt Paula was staring at Brenda with her mouth slightly open, but it was my cousin Janet who spoke first. "Wait a minute," she said slowly. "Brenda, didn't you tell me last month that you were worried about Martha's organization? You said something about their funding being unstable." All eyes turned to Brenda, who was no longer the composed, successful sister who'd walked into this room 2 hours earlier. Her carefully applied makeup couldn't hide the pallor of her skin, and her hands were trembling slightly as she clasped them in her lap. "I may have mentioned some concerns," she said carefully. "When you work in corporate consulting, you develop an eye for organizational weaknesses. I was just worried about Martha being in a vulnerable position if something happened." "But how did you know something was going to happen?" Janet pressed. "You were talking like it was inevitable, not like it was a possibility." Mom found her voice. "Brenda, is what Martha's saying true? Have you been interfering in her life?" For a moment, I thought Brenda might continue to deny everything. Her expression cycled through several emotions: calculation, defiance, fear, and something that might have been relief. When she finally spoke, her voice was different, harder, more honest than I'd heard it in years. "You want to know the truth? Fine. Yes, I've been protecting this family from Martha's poor decisions. Yes, I've prevented her from making mistakes that would have embarrassed all of us. And yes, I've made sure she had support and opportunities that were actually appropriate for her abilities." The admission hung in the air like a bomb. Even I was stunned by her directness, by her complete abandonment of the caring sister persona. "Protecting the family," Mom's voice was sharp. "By destroying your sister's opportunities, by managing them," Brenda corrected. "Do you know what would have happened if Martha had gotten that scholarship and finished her degree with no debt? She'd have taken some idealistic job at a nonprofit that paid $30,000 a year and felt proud of herself for saving the world. She'd never have developed practical skills or real-world experience. That was my choice to make," I said. "And you'd have made the wrong choice, just like you did with Kevin. Do you know what Kevin is doing now? He's a partner at a law firm in Chicago. He has a beautiful wife and 2 kids and a house in the suburbs. If you'd stayed with him, you'd have been holding him back, making him feel guilty for outgrowing you professionally." Mom stood up abruptly. "Brenda, stop talking." But Brenda was past the point of stopping. Years of carefully managed deception were pouring out in a torrent of justified cruelty. "And Alex, the man you're so upset about losing, he owned 3 restaurants and was looking for a wife who could be a partner in building his business. You would have been a liability. A server with a community college degree and no business experience. I saved you from humiliating yourself. Those weren't your decisions to make," Uncle Herbert said, his voice heavy with disappointment. "Someone had to make them. Martha has always been too emotional, too trusting, too willing to accept situations that weren't good enough. She needed guidance, and Mom was too soft-hearted to provide it. The attack on Mom was the final straw. Whatever sympathy anyone in the room might have had for Brenda's twisted logic evaporated completely. "Get out," Mom said quietly. "What? Get out of my house. Right now." Brenda looked around the room, perhaps finally realizing that she'd crossed a line she couldn't uncross. The faces staring back at her held no warmth, no understanding, no forgiveness. "Mom, you're overreacting. In 10 years, you'll understand that everything I did was for Martha's own good, and for this family's reputation." "Get out," Mom repeated, her voice stronger now. "And don't come back until you're ready to apologize to your sister and mean it." Brenda gathered her purse and coat with as much dignity as she could muster. But the damage was done. As she walked toward the door, she paused and looked back at me. "You think you've won something here, Martha, but all you've done is destroy the only person who's ever truly looked out for your best interests. Good luck managing your life without my help." The front door closed behind her with a soft click, leaving the rest of us in stunned silence. The weeks that followed were unlike anything I'd experienced in my adult life. For the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe. The constant low-level anxiety that had plagued me for so long, the sense that disaster was always lurking around the corner, began to fade. Mom called me the morning after Thanksgiving, her voice thick with tears and regret. "Martha, I owe you the biggest apology of my life. I failed you as a mother. I let my pride in Brenda's success blind me to what was really happening. I let you suffer for years because I couldn't see past the surface." The conversation lasted 3 hours. We talked about moments from my childhood and adolescence that suddenly made sense in a new context. The times when opportunities had fallen through and Brenda had been there to comfort me. The relationships that had ended badly, followed by Brenda's gentle suggestions that I deserved better. The patterns that should have been obvious but had been hidden by Brenda's careful management of the narrative. Mom told me about conversations she'd had with Brenda over the years. Moments when she'd wondered if her younger daughter's concern for me seemed excessive or oddly specific. But she'd dismissed her doubts, attributing them to her own guilt about favoring Brenda's obvious success over my quieter struggles. The healing process wasn't immediate or easy. 20 years of conditional love and skewed family dynamics don't disappear overnight. But for the first time, I felt like my mother was actually seeing me, not comparing me to an idealized version of my sister or waiting for me to transform into someone worthy of pride. 3 weeks after Thanksgiving, I got a call from a woman named Dr. Sarah Chen, the director of a family services nonprofit in the next county. She'd heard about my experience through professional networks and was looking for someone with my background to head up a new program for family crisis intervention. The job was everything I dreamed of: meaningful work, room for growth, a salary that would allow me to live comfortably valuably while making a difference. During the interview process, Dr. Chen mentioned that she'd specifically sought out someone who understood family dysfunction from personal experience. The best advocates are people who've walked through fire themselves, she said. Your willingness to stand up for the truth, even when it costs you family relationships, tells me a lot about your character. I started the new job in January, and for the first time in my professional life, I felt completely aligned with my work. Without Brenda's subtle undermining, without the constant messages designed to make me doubt my capabilities, I discovered that I was actually quite good at what I did. Brenda tried to contact me several times in those first few months. Text messages that started with apologies but quickly devolved into justifications. Phone calls that I didn't answer. A letter delivered to my new apartment that I threw away unopened. Through Mom, I learned that Brenda was struggling with the consequences of her actions. Several family members had stopped speaking to her entirely. Her carefully curated image as the perfect daughter and sister had been shattered, and she was having difficulty accepting responsibility for the role she'd played in damaging not just my life, but the family as a whole. 6 months after that Thanksgiving dinner, she finally sent a message that was different from the others. Simple, direct, and honest. Martha, I know I don't deserve forgiveness, but I want you to know that I understand now how wrong I was. I'm in therapy trying to figure out why I felt the need to control your life instead of focusing on my own. I hope someday you'll be willing to talk to me, but I understand if that day never comes. I didn't respond immediately. The wounds were still too fresh, and I was still learning how to trust my own judgment without the constant interference of someone who claimed to know what was best for me. But I kept the message, because buried underneath all the pain and betrayal was the memory of a little girl who'd once been my best friend, who'd shared secrets and dreams and midnight giggles. That girl had been lost somewhere along the way, replaced by someone who'd confused love with control, care with manipulation. Maybe someday, if Brenda did the hard work of understanding why she'd needed to diminish me to feel valuable herself, we could find our way back to being sisters. Real sisters, not the performer and her audience that we'd become. But that was a possibility for the future. In the present, I was focused on building a life that was entirely my own, making decisions based on my own judgment, taking risks without someone whispering reasons why I might fail. Celebrating successes without worrying that they might threaten someone else's position as the family star. The truth had changed everything, just like I'd known it would. Not just for me, but for everyone who'd been living with the distorted version of reality that Brenda had so carefully constructed. Sometimes the truth doesn't set everyone free, but it definitely sets you free. And sometimes that's enough. Have you ever had to choose between keeping the peace and telling a truth that would change everything? Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what you think about family dynamics like this. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life stories about finding your voice and standing up for yourself. Share this video with someone who might need to hear that their instincts about family manipulation could be right. And remember, sometimes the people who claim to love you the most are the ones who have the most invested in keeping you small. Trust yourself, set boundaries, and never let anyone convince you that their control is the same thing as their care. Thank you for listening to my story, and I hope it helps you recognize your own worth and the right to live your life on your own terms.